Preview.
March 1990. An Air Force base in Belgium scrambles 2 F-16s to investigate a possible violation of Belgian airspace. Yves Milbergs is one of the pilots ordered to address the threat.
The operations center told us something was going on with the UFO over Belgium.
Captain Milbergs has been briefed with a description of the object given by an eyewitness on the ground.
It was a kind of object of triangular shape, okay, with lights on the edge, kind of dome on top, moving really slowly without noise, and sometimes accelerating very fast beyond supersonic speeds. The order was to intercept and eventually identify those objects.
The Belgian Air Force report presents an exact timeline of the evening. 12:30 a.m. Milbergs makes radar contact 20 nautical miles from Beauvechine Air Force Base. It appears to be moving at 740 knots.
So we picked up the target the first time at about 20 miles. We had a radar contact, so we could see on the radar a blip.
This is the actual radar recording from Captain Milbergs' F-16. The square at the top is the target.
Which was, in fact, the confirmation that there was something in the air at that moment. And it was the same contact as the ground station observed as well.
But just as the 2 F-16 pilots think they are closing in, the target vanishes. If it was an intrusion by a foreign military, it escaped before being seen. If it was a false radar reading, there was nothing there in the first place. But some believed in another possibility. In the months leading up to this incident, hundreds of Belgians had reported seeing triangular aircraft. It all started in the small town of Eupen, just 6 miles from the German border. 2 police officers on patrol reported something unusual in the sky.
They noticed very bright lights hovering over an open field. And these bright lights were fixed to some type of triangular platform, as they described it.
Author and UFO researcher David Marler investigated this incident.
The object encompassed the field that was near their vehicle. It was silent.
They claimed the object then began to move slowly toward the town.
They were gobsmacked as far as what they were looking at. They had no frame of reference for this.
The initial 2 police officers who saw it light up the field, they followed it for a while.
Author and investigative journalist Leslie Kane has interviewed many who claimed to have seen something that night.
And it ended up over Lake Gillespie. They watched the thing for over an hour sitting above Lake Gillespie. And what they saw was something extraordinary. The craft was releasing a red light ball that was shooting out horizontally along the surface of the lake, and then it was pulling it back in.
Then, the 2 officers say they saw a second triangular UFO rising up over a row of trees by the edge of the lake, then hovering silently alongside the first UFO.
They contacted the dispatcher in Yupon, and he laughed and said it might be Santa Claus, coming in to land. And they stated that we're not joking, this is something very serious.
During this period, there were many reported sightings of unidentified triangular craft all over the Belgian countryside, but no photos, video, or other hard evidence to confirm their existence. Instead, many of the witnesses sketched what they claimed to have seen. The drawings are strikingly similar. Ever since the sightings in Belgium, there have been thousands of similar reports all over Europe and North America. Black, delta-shaped flying objects that became known as black triangles. Could these sightings be explained by some natural phenomena? Could they be a case of mass delusion? Or do they defy explanation?
In the 90s, black triangles usurped saucers for a while.
Michael Shermer is a science author and publisher of Skeptic magazine.
People say, well, I saw these weird lights in the sky. It was 6 p.m. It was just getting dark, and it was sort of triangular shaped, and then zoomed off. So that makes a big story.
After the first sightings over Eupen in November of 1989, Belgian UFOs became the media topic of the day. Reporters asked if alien spacecraft were hovering over the country. Amid the increasing publicity, Belgians made over 500 claims of UFO sightings. Authorities found themselves in a UFO wave. Some call it a frenzy, a phenomenon that some say has more to do with psychology than reality.
UFO sightings are by definition unidentified, so we don't know what they are.
Dr. Roger Lanius is an associate director at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum.
One of the things that tends to happen with many people is that when they believe certain things are out there, any piece of evidence that they can come up with that might confirm that, they latch upon.
Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out only information that confirms one's beliefs.
Confirmation bias is the tendency to find confirmatory evidence for what you already believe and discount or rationalize disconfirming evidence. That is, we remember the hits, we forget the misses.
But whether the black triangles were real or imagined, the reports kept coming. Even with no hard evidence, officials took notice. Which is perhaps why the Belgian Air Force scrambled 2 F-16s to investigate a report at the height of the UFO wave. It was an attempt to pin down some hard evidence and confront what could have been a tangible threat.
The Belgian Air Force was concerned about this and had to take some action because there was something invading their airspace.
The night's events began to unfold before 11 p.m. An off-duty police officer reported seeing 3 strange lights over the town of Jean-Bleu. He said the lights form a triangle.
The Belgian wave really came to a head on the night of March 30th, 1990. This involved sightings being reported by the citizenry in several municipalities.
The Belgian Air Force report states that at 11 p.m., the Glans Control Reporting Center received a phone call from the policeman reporting the strange lights in the sky. 15 minutes later, their military radar picked up an unidentified object moving very slowly at 25 knots towards the west. Then, another Air Force radar station center confirmed the target in the same position. Glans Control gave the order to scramble jets. Pilot Yves Milbergs picks up the target on his radar about 7 nautical miles away. He still can't see it.
It was dark, there was no lights at the object, and we couldn't see anything.
Relying only on their instruments, the 2 F-16 pilots moved to engage the target. If it's a breach of Belgian airspace by a foreign military, what Milbergs does next could spark an international incident. The report says the pilots managed to lock onto the target 3 times, but each time it evaded them. The report states the object appeared to accelerate from 150 to 970 knots, or almost 1,200 miles per hour, in just a few seconds.
We could manage to close in and to close the unidentified object. What is that object? Because so far we still don't know.
But Belgian officials still needed an explanation for the numerous eyewitness reports. They turned to Air Force Chief of Operations, Colonel Wilford de Brouwer, who proposes a theory.
The only thing he could think about was that it could be some kind of stealth technology from America.
It's conceivable that some of them might be testing programs for exotic types of flying vehicles. That has happened in the past. There were sightings, for instance, in the 1970s and early 80s, before the programs were revealed, of stealth technology that was being tested.
This Department of Defense intelligence report reveals that Colonel DeBrouwer contacted officials in the United States about 2 top-secret stealth planes. The F-117 Nighthawk and the B-2 stealth bomber. They are both black and have an unusual triangular shape. Is it possible that one of these aircraft was behind the eyewitness reports of that night?
He was informed very clearly that it was not. And this is written up in an official American document, that the Americans informed him that it was not one of theirs.
Either it was a straight denial, or the Pentagon was hiding the test of a secret aircraft.
It's always a remote possibility that something that people see in the sky could be a classified program under test.
Bill Sweetman is an aviation writer and expert in top-secret military projects.
The late 80s were a time when the black project world was expanding very fast.
Could the Americans have been secretly testing new aircraft in that area?
The triangles could conceivably be aircraft. There have been aircraft designs studied that look like that.
Belgium's location near the eastern front of the Cold War could have made it an enticing test site.
There might be a few reasons why you'd test a secret aircraft outside the US. You might want to test it against different defensive systems. You might want to fly close to the former Soviet Union and just see if anything would pick it up.
If the sightings were of top-secret American aircraft, the US might officially deny their existence, even to their allies. With the public demanding answers, Colonel DeBrouwer made an unprecedented move and called a press conference. He qualified his statement with many ifs, as he could not rule out a radar error.
L'objet, s'il y en a eu un, a accéléré à une vitesse qui était tout à fait en dehors du domaine de vol d'un avion conventionnel.
The Belgians released the radar recording from the cockpit of Captain Mielberg's F-16 and invited expert interpretation of what can be a fickle technology.
Radar is generally reliable, but like any other technology, there's going to be a residue of anomalies of stuff that happens we can't explain. And so like with everything else in science, what do you do with that residue of anomalies? Nothing. We just can't explain everything. So a radar operator sees a blip is there, the blip is gone, what was it? I don't know.
It's making incredible changes in speed. The speed jumps from about 175 knots to about 600 knots in less than a second. That is an insane acceleration that just doesn't seem physically possible. It then does another jump right at the end. It's moving at 1,000 knots toward the ground. We haven't recovered any debris from any crashes.
It's a fascinating theory and could explain this particular incident, especially since the flight crew never actually saw an object.
We still don't know exactly what happened that day, that's for sure. We know what didn't happen, that's for sure. It was not a meteorological phenomena, it was not a helicopter, it was not a prototype and stuff like that. But it's still unidentified object so far.
After the Air Force incident ended with nothing but odd radar readings and unanswered questions, Black Triangle sightings decreased. The frenzy in Belgium died down. But 3 years later, there was another mysterious incident, this time in Britain.
I think within hours, it was clear that we really did have a staggeringly significant event on our hands.
"140 miles northeast of London, exactly 3 years after the sightings in Belgium, 2 Royal Air Force policemen are on patrol outside the RAF airbase in Cosford. According to their report,
A patrol of Air Force police stopped their car, got out, and looked directly overhead. They saw two bright white lights, but they weren't able to ascertain whether or not they were separate objects or lights on the underside of a much bigger craft.
The two corporals return immediately to base and file this report. It is the earliest account of the strange events of the night, events that became known as the Cosford Incident.
This is RAF Cosford, where the UFO sighting actually took place.
In 1993, Nick Pope worked for the British Ministry of Defence, investigating unidentified flying objects.
My job was to research and investigate all sightings reported to the Ministry of Defence to see if there was evidence of any potential threat to the United Kingdom.
This is Pope's official Ministry of Defence report. It documents the most prolific wave of UFO sightings in British history.
This sighting at Cosford really kick-started an investigation which was to bring in dozens and dozens of other reports, including sightings of large triangular-shaped craft.
It wasn't just military personnel who filed reports. 10 minutes after the sightings at RAF Cosford, there are more reported sightings 18 miles northeast of the base.
One family saw the UFO in a town called Rugeley. They got into their car, as I recall, and actually tried to chase this thing. One of the witnesses described this vast craft passing directly overhead. They heard a humming sound coming from it, and they thought that this thing was so low that it had actually landed in a field in a place called Hazelside. And when they got to the area, there was nothing to be seen.
There were also no impressions on the ground to indicate that anything had landed.
The RAF police determined that no military or civil aircraft activity had taken place that night that might explain these sightings. This was not just a UFO sighting, it was essentially a security incident.
As military police at RAF Cosford secured the base, just 20 miles away at a second military base, the meteorological officer on duty reported seeing a similar unidentified flying object.
He described it to me as a vast triangular or delta-shaped craft. He saw a pencil-thin beam of light shoot down from this craft and track backwards and forwards. He said almost as if it was looking for something. Then he said after a few minutes, the UFO accelerated away to the horizon many times faster than a military jet. And he said, well, look, I see fast jets on an almost daily basis. This was orders of magnitude above and beyond that speed.
While stories like this sound persuasive, eyewitness testimony is often unreliable.
Eyewitnesses misperceive things, they distort things, they retell things, and not just people that see UFOs, people that see anything. We know from research that, eyewitness accounts are not reliable. Mine's not any better than yours, and, so we have to actually have physical evidence, or else we don't really have a case.
But eyewitness accounts were all there was to go on. 200 of them, over 8 hours, from all over southern England. Pope and his colleagues were left to sort through the stories, trying to find explanations that would account for this spate of reports.
One by one, we eliminated all the usual things that people misidentify. Bright stars and planets, satellites, meteors, aircraft lights, weather balloon launches. And the more of these explanations we crossed off, the more mysterious and exciting this seemed to be. And the sense from my colleagues and myself, who normally came at this from a very skeptical viewpoint, was, my goodness, there is something really bizarre going on here.
After a month-long investigation, Pope's team concluded that people saw some sort of real object. Despite this conclusion, they had no hard evidence to prove it, much less any idea of the origin or nature of such a craft.
One of our theories, of course, was secret prototype aircraft or drone.
Just as the Belgians had done, the British asked the United States government if it was one of theirs, a large triangular craft capable of hovering, and they got the same answer.
Now, the Americans told us, we have no such aircraft, and no such test flights have been conducted over the United Kingdom.
Still suspicious, Pope used a back channel to inquire if the CIA or other defense agencies might have been involved.
The American Defense Secretary was apparently incandescent with rage. If we say it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. And we had to act very quickly to stop this flaring up into a full diplomatic row with our greatest ally.
With his investigation at a dead end, Nick Pope can only wonder what really happened that night.
I have no realistic assessment of what this could be. If it wasn't some secret prototype aircraft decades ahead of anything that's public knowledge, then I'm stumped. I have no idea.
Officials in Belgium and England were not able to come up with a feasible explanation for this rash of sightings. With only eyewitness reports to go on, there were limited scientific avenues to pursue. But soon, it would be America's turn to deal with mystery triangles.
I've got that object inside also. It's huge.
In St. Clair County, Illinois, Officer Ed Barton is on overnight patrol when he receives a call from Central Police Dispatch.
Well, this is a 6 call from Highland PD.
As he gets the call, Officer Barton is driving south on the main road into the small city of Lebanon. This is the actual police recording from that night.
The truck driver just stopped in and said there was a flying object in the area of Lebanon.
This recording presents a minute-by-minute account of the strange events that unfolded in Illinois.
It's very rare that we have official documentation that chronicles the wave of sightings as it was taking place.
Journalist David Marler is a member of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which investigates UFO sightings. In 2000, Marler looked into this case.
The overall tone of the recordings at first were somewhat lighthearted and jovial.
It was like a 2-story house. It had white lights and red blinking lights. Possibly, could you check the area?
If I see it, I'm not saying a word.
Officer Ed Barton, he was ready to simply write it off. But then he noticed lights moving toward the east part of town. Upon closer approach, he realized that the lights were affixed to a large triangular object that was low altitude.
There's a very bright white light east of town. Also, there's maybe an aircraft. It doesn't look like an aircraft, though.
In my personal investigation of the case, I spoke with Officer Ed Barton from Lebanon, Illinois.
This is the statement Officer Barton gave to David Marler 10 days after the event. In it, he says that the object hovered at about 1,000 feet, almost directly overhead.
Officer Barton stated, as this object was hovering above me, every aircraft that I've ever seen or know of makes some type of noise. This aircraft made no noise.
After several minutes, he claims the object pivoted and sped toward the southwest at high speed. He wonders if it's some kind of experimental military craft.
Would you contact Scott Air Force Base to see if there has anything flying in this area, please?
Scott Air Force Base is only 3 miles away. Officer Barton thinks it could be one of theirs.
It's heading westbound now. It should be really close to Scott now. Matter of fact, if the Shiloh officer looks up, they can probably see it by now.
The village of Shiloh is right next to Scott Air Force Base. At 4:24 a.m., Shiloh police officer David Martin responds to Barton's call.
2550, I see something, but I don't know what that is.
But just as he thinks he catches a glimpse of the object, it appears to suddenly shoot away at high speed into the distance. 15 minutes later, outside the town of Millstadt, Officer Craig Stevens says he spots it.
CENTCOM 6004.
Go ahead.
I've got that object inside also.
Are you serious?
It's huge.
6004, does it look like what does it look like to you?
It's kind of V-shaped.
Officer Stevens tries to take a photo of what he's seeing. But due to the freezing conditions, the Polaroid doesn't turn out. There appears to be lights on the image, but there's no way to tell if it's a real physical object. Days later, Stevens makes these sketches for David Marler's report. He draws an object that is distinctly triangular. On the same night, in the town of Dupo, a fourth officer reports seeing something. Plotting the four sightings on a map, one can imagine a flight path traveling 38 miles over a 1-hour period. However, all they have is eyewitness testimony. There's no tangible evidence to examine. But the media doesn't need hard evidence to publish a story. The so-called Highland UFO made headlines. Newspaper accounts may have been fueled by the British and Belgian sightings a decade earlier. Triangle-shaped UFOs were now part of pop culture, and skeptics believe the accounts color popular perception.
UFO frenzies usually begin with either a single sighting or a sighting that was witnessed by multiple people. And then it gets reported, and if it gets picked up in the media, then that can start to drive the number of column inches. Then what becomes the story is not the UFO sighting, it's the event surrounding it. And that's the beginning of a myth. That's how myths are created. The biggest problem with UFO investigators is that they almost all believe. They're not objective enough. They're too driven by what they would like to be true.
They do have a preconceived belief that UFOs are out there, that they are extraterrestrial in origin, and they are searching for evidence of that. And they are spring-loaded to find that evidence. Since I personally do not believe we are being visited by extraterrestrials, I'm spring-loaded in the other direction, and I'm willing to admit that.
David Marler investigates UFO sightings for MUFON, an organization that believes UFOs may have alien origins. Marler's research, like the Belgians and Nick Pope before him, began by trying to rule out the military.
I was mainly interested in seeing if the military was testing any type of experimental aircraft that might have been in the area. The fact that it was seen near a major military installation warranted that question.
The estimated flight path of the alleged UFO shows it would have flown within 2 miles of Scott Air Force Base. The police and military declined to comment. Then, David Marler took the investigation a step further.
I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Scott Air Force Base, and I have the official documentation as a result.
In a letter dated 2 weeks after the event, the commander of Scott Air Force Base responded to Marler's questions.
They came back and stated negative, that they had no military aircraft in the area. They weren't testing or supporting the test of any vehicle in the area at that time.
Marler then requested the radar data, hoping to get at least some hard evidence from that night.
They stated that at the time of the UFO sighting, their radar systems were down. They were not operating.
Military answers are often elusive with regards to questions that could be prying into top-secret programs. So, with compelling eyewitness reports, but limited evidence to go on, Marler tries to connect the dots.
Initially, I thought it was military in origin. It seemed to be the most practical explanation. But when we look at the eyewitness testimony, when we look at the description of this large triangular UFO, it bears striking similarities to Belgium, to Cosford, and at this point we have to look at this information and come away with the fact that these witnesses are essentially describing the same type of object, if not the same object.
Bill Sweetman also sees a link between the objects.
There are conceivable aircraft that would account for some of the phenomena that people have described as black triangles, would account for some of the things seen at Cosford, some of the things seen in Belgium. But most of what has gone on in the black world, we really don't know anything about.
Most top-secret projects tested in the 1980s and 90s have not been declassified.
I would think that There have been tens of programs over the years that have at least reached the flight test stage. We know of perhaps 2 or 3 that have been declassified. So perhaps 10% of what has happened we know about.
Could the reported black triangles turn out to be ultra top secret projects not yet disclosed to the public? Marler turns to the past to explain the present, digging into the historical record to shed light on the mystery.
When we look at the history of the reports of triangular UFOs, I knew that the reports went back several decades. I had no idea how far back they in fact went.
One of Marler's sources for UFO research is the U.S. military itself.
I'm skeptical that we'll ever get a definitive explanation of this, but of course I hope that some new information does come to light and we finally solve the mystery.